Story number 1.
The mirror in room 6. Lydia had always loved staying in quirky bed and breakfast during her road trips. This time she found herself at the Silver Pines Inn, a quaint, timber-framed lodge nestled deep in the mountains. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove, seemed delighted to have a guest, though Lydia noticed her enthusiasm waver slightly when she mentioned she'd booked room 6. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer room 4? It has a lovely view of the lake," Mrs. Hargrove suggested. "No, I'm fine with room 6, Lydia replied. "I'm just staying the night." Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, but eventually handed over the key. "If you need anything, let me know." Room 6 was charming in a rustic way, with a 4-poster bed, floral wallpaper, and a large antique mirror mounted above the dresser. The mirror's ornate wooden frame was covered in carvings of vines and roses, though the glass itself was slightly warped, giving reflections a faintly distorted appearance. As Lydia unpacked her bag, she noticed something odd. The mirror didn't reflect the room exactly as it was. In her reflection, the bed was unmade and the curtains were drawn, though in reality the bed was neatly made and the curtains were open to the evening light. "Old glass," she muttered to herself, brushing it off. But as she turned to leave the room, she froze. In the mirror, there was a figure standing in the corner, a shadowy silhouette that wasn't there when she looked directly at the corner. Lydia's heart raced, but when she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. "Get a grip," she told herself. "It's just your imagination." She decided to head downstairs for dinner, hoping to shake off the unsettling feeling. Over a bowl of soup, she struck up a conversation with Mrs. Hargrove. "This place has quite a history, doesn't it?" Lydia asked. Mrs. Hargrove's expression grew guarded. "It does. The inn has been here for over a century." "What about room 6? Lydia pressed. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, then said, "That room has its quirks. Some guests have mentioned odd experiences, but nothing harmful." Lydia wasn't reassured. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Lydia avoided looking at the mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. Finally, curiosity got the better of her. She turned to face the mirror, forcing herself to examine it closely. At first, it reflected only her and the room, but as she stared longer, the image began to change. The wallpaper peeled away in the reflection, revealing charred wooden beams. The bed was scorched, its frame blackened. And then she saw the figure again. It was a woman this time, her face obscured by long, dark hair. She stood at the foot of the bed, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Lydia stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. She turned away, but in her peripheral vision, the mirror's image continued to shift. The woman in the reflection moved closer, her head twitching with each step. "No," Lydia whispered, backing toward the door. The woman in the mirror raised her hand, pointing directly at Lydia. And then Lydia heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind her. "Don't leave." Panicking, Lydia bolted from the room and ran downstairs. Mrs. Hargrove was in the sitting room, knitting by the fire. "You saw her, didn't you?" Mrs. Hargrove asked without looking up. Lydia froze. "You knew?" Mrs. Hargrove sighed. "It's not the first time. The woman in the mirror was a guest here long ago. She died in room 6, in a fire that destroyed part of the inn. They say her spirit lingers, trapped in the glass." "Why didn't you tell me?" Lydia demanded. "I didn't think she'd show herself to you," Mrs. Hargrove said quietly. "She doesn't always appear." Lydia didn't return to room 6. She spent the night on the sofa in the sitting room, unable to sleep. The next morning she checked out, vowing never to return to the Silver Pines Inn. But the mirror's image stayed with her. Weeks later, back in her apartment, Lydia noticed something chilling. In her own mirror, just faintly, she could see the warped reflection of room 6 and the woman, still watching her.
Story number 2.
The last train home. Evelyn had always loved taking the train. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the low hum of conversation, and the occasional whistle in the distance were soothing. But that night, the train felt different. It was late, almost midnight, when Evelyn boarded the last train home after visiting her sister in the city. The station had been eerily empty, its fluorescent lights flickering as if the place itself wanted to sleep. She shrugged off the unease and found an empty carriage settling into a window seat. The train pulled away and the familiar sights of the city gave way to the countryside. Evelyn tried to relax, but something was off. The carriage was too quiet. At first she thought she was alone, but as the train passed through a dimly lit tunnel, she caught a glimpse of another passenger in the reflection of the window. A man, sitting several rows behind her. Evelyn turned to look, but the seat was empty. Her heart skipped. She glanced back at the window. The reflection of the man was still there, his face obscured by shadows. She stood and turned again, peering down the length of the carriage. No one. She laughed nervously to herself, chalking it up to exhaustion. "Just my imagination," she muttered, sitting back down. The train rumbled on, passing through dark fields and sparse forests. Evelyn tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone, but the signal was weak and the screen flickered strangely. A movement in the window caught her eye. The man's reflection was closer now, just a few rows behind her. Evelyn froze. Her pulse quickened as she forced herself to look over her shoulder. Still nothing. The seats were empty. "Can I help you?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. The train slowed as it approached a station, its brakes screeching in protest. Evelyn felt a wave of relief. She wasn't sure if she'd get off, but seeing other passengers board would make her feel less alone. The train stopped, but no one boarded. The platform was deserted, the lights flickering like those at the station she'd left. As the train pulled away, Evelyn noticed a sign on the platform. "No service, after 11:30 p.m. She checked her watch. It was 11:45. The train plunged into darkness as it entered another tunnel. Evelyn's ears popped and the air grew colder. She rubbed her arms for warmth and glanced at the window again. The man was now directly behind her. Evelyn didn't turn around this time. She couldn't. Her body felt paralyzed, her breath shallow. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the train's rumble. The reflection leaned closer, its shadowy face inches from hers. "I never left," it whispered back. The lights in the carriage flickered violently, plunging the space into strobe-like chaos. In the flashes of light, Evelyn saw him clearly. A gaunt, pale figure with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. She screamed, leaping from her seat and running toward the next carriage. The door was locked. She banged on it, her panic rising. The lights flickered again, and she saw the man standing at the far end of the carriage, motionless. Then he started walking toward her. Evelyn scrambled to the emergency stop lever and yanked it. The train screeched, throwing her off balance. The lights went out entirely, leaving her in pitch darkness. When the train finally stopped, Evelyn felt her way to the nearest door and forced it open. Cold air rushed in as she stumbled onto the tracks. She ran, her flashlight from her bag barely illuminating the way. Behind her, the train sat like a sleeping beast, its windows dark and lifeless. But then she heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind her. Evelyn turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The man stood on the tracks, his hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Evelyn screamed and ran, her legs burning as she pushed herself forward. She didn't stop until she saw the faint glow of another station ahead. When she reached it, the station was empty, just like the others. A single bench sat under a flickering light, and a lone sign read, "Welcome to Terminus." The train she'd fled pulled into the station behind her, its doors hissing open. But it wasn't empty anymore. Every window was filled with pale, hollow-eyed passengers, all staring at her. The last thing Evelyn saw was the man stepping off the train, his hand outstretched as everything went dark.
Story number 3.
The Whistling Woods. The locals of Ridgewood had a simple rule: never enter the Whistling Woods after dark. The forest earned its name from the eerie whistling sounds that echoed through its trees every night. Some claimed it was the wind, but others whispered of something more sinister. Alex, a skeptic and amateur filmmaker, dismissed the warnings as small-town superstition. He decided to document the forest for his next project. Armed with a camera, flashlight, and a determination to prove the locals wrong, he ventured into the whistling woods on a moonless night. The forest was dense, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. Alex's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing gnarled branches that seemed to reach for him. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with silence, unnaturally so. He walked deeper, his boots crunching on the leaf-covered ground. It wasn't long before he heard it. A faint whistle. At first it was distant, almost melodic. Alex paused, his camera rolling. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though his voice wavered. But the whistle grew louder, closer. It wasn't the random howl of the wind, it was deliberate, as though someone was whistling a tune. "Hello?" Alex called out, his voice swallowed by the trees. "Is someone there?" The whistling stopped. Alex felt a chill creep up his spine. He swung his flashlight around, but the forest revealed nothing. Shaking his head, he pressed on. As he ventured further, the whistling returned, this time from multiple directions. It surrounded him, echoing off the trees. Each whistle seemed to carry a strange, mournful tone, like a song without words. His heartbeat quickened. "It's just the wind," he repeated, more to himself than his camera. But deep down, he didn't believe it. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. The trees looked warped, their trunks twisted unnaturally. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and the air reeked of decay. Alex's flashlight flickered. He smacked it, and the beam steadied, but only barely. The whistling grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer a tune, it sounded like a call. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow darted between the trees. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, spinning around. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, the whistling stopped, plunging the forest into an oppressive silence. Alex's breathing grew ragged as he pressed on, the camera shaking in his hands. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. Suddenly, he heard a rustling behind him. He turned, his flashlight trembling, and caught a glimpse of something, or someone, standing between the trees. It was tall and humanoid, but its limbs were unnaturally thin, and its head tilted at an odd angle. "Hey!" Alex shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Instead, it began to whistle. The sound was piercing, unnatural, and louder than anything Alex had heard before. It vibrated through his chest, sending waves of panic through him. "Enough of this," he muttered, turning to run. But the forest seemed to shift around him. No matter which direction he went, the trees closed in, the path twisting and turning as if the woods themselves were alive. The whistling followed him, growing louder and closer with every step. Finally, Alex tripped and fell into a clearing. His flashlight rolled away, its weak beam illuminating the edge of the circle. He scrambled to his feet only to realize he wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, dozens of them. They were thin, almost skeletal, their faces obscured by darkness. Each one stood motionless, except for their heads, which swayed back and forth as they whistled in unison. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. The whistling stopped abruptly, and one of the figures stepped forward. Its face came into view, or what should have been its face. There was nothing but smooth, pale skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The figure tilted its head, and though it had no mouth, Alex heard a voice. "Stay." Alex turned and ran, his lungs burning as he tore through the forest. The whistling resumed, louder and more chaotic, as if the figures were chasing him. He didn't stop until he saw the faint glow of the forest's edge. With one final burst of energy, he broke through the trees and collapsed onto the roadside. A passing truck stopped, and the driver helped him into the cab. "You're lucky to be alive," the man said, glancing nervously at the forest. Alex didn't respond. He stared back at the whistling woods, where faint shapes lingered just beyond the tree line. As the truck drove away, He heard it one last time, a single mournful whistle, carrying a promise. Next time, you won't leave.